Jeremy Tennell. Streaming to you recorded from Seattle, Washington. Here we go. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Plowline podcast. I'm Jeremy Tennell, your host, and today I am joined with a guest that I met at a conference a couple of months ago, and we struck up a great conversation. I am here with Megan Jasurda, who is the director of the Disability Support Services Department at Clark Community College in Vancouver, Washington. And Megan has been doing this work for about 15 years. She's been with three different colleges over that time. And as we were getting to know each other and engaging in this conversation, I had a lot of curiosity about the work of equality and equity within disability services, and she was extraordinarily informative. So I wanted to introduce her today and have her engage in a conversation. Morning, Megan.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Glad to have you.
Yeah.
Give me a little bit of background. How did you get into disability support services, and where did that all evolve from?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in the Midwest, small town, central Wisconsin, and you'll hear the accent now that I've said it. But yeah, I really, as a kind of middle school, high schooler, I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. Did any of us? I don't know, but I was very active. I found that I was my best self and could learn best when I was active. And so I was a dancer because that was very just kinesthetic for me. I didn't know what I wanted to go to college for, so I went to college for dance. I was a dance major. I know,
That's great.
interesting.
Where at?
And then really fell into higher education shortly after finishing my bachelor's degree. I was one of the only adjunct faculty hired at Lower Columbia College in Washington with a bachelor's degree because they were building a new art center. They needed someone certified in Pilates for PE and a dance teacher, and they couldn't find anyone with a master's degree. So I was hired, right? It's kind of lucky. And I was an adjunct faculty for a couple of years, and then really fell into disability services when they had a vacancy at that college. And I had already been advocating for students with disabilities on campus, especially some of our deaf students were taking my classes, and I was helping them start clubs, and really just fell into disability services and quickly found that this is what I wanted to focus my master's program on, which I was starting. And I got my master's program at Portland State, and in their what's called their PACed post-secondary education and continuing education program, and focused on my research all on students with disabilities. So really fell into the field through that kind of avenue, and have been in the field, 15 years. But I think what motivates me to stay in disability support services, because I've had other opportunities that I haven't taken, is the students. Is the really supporting and advocating for a group that often gets left out or not considered. And kind of been my path.
Yeah, I think that's that is kind of the starting point of the curiosity for me was this seems to be something that impacts so many, and anybody can become a member of this group, and yet at the same time it doesn't seem to quite get the focus that it deserves.
Absolutely.
How do you bring that focus in your job? Where do you? I would imagine at your level, you're probably sitting at cabinet or something like that, advising.
Yeah, if I'm lucky, sometimes. Last week, but I as a director, I'm more of a middle manager in a big organization at the college I'm at. But I do get to be a leader or a key leader for the institution on disability topics, and thinking about that with policy and practice and how we plan to be inclusive for people with disabilities. I think that every organization, you know, middle to big business should really have somebody leading the disability efforts because it's ensuring the basics of what the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, requires, which is that constituents, employees, your customers, students in education can request reasonable accommodation as is their disability rights, but it's more than that. So the whole purpose of the ADA was to have basic human rights and protections, but the spirit of the ADA, what a lot of disability pioneers talk about, or the intent is really to feel included.
Mm.
And not as marginalized. So I think there's so much that we could talk about, but I think starting to think as professionals, as people, how do our organizations and businesses have leaders that think about like disability inclusion, these concepts of disability justice, and having awareness trainings and infusing that into our equity trainings and conversations and making people with disabilities feel welcome, belonged. Because as you said, Jeremy, we could become a part of this group at any time.
Yes.
We could wake up tomorrow and have a new health condition. We could have a traumatic event or a car accident happen to us and things are different and we have to start kind of learning different and having different limitations, or having a different mental health experience, right?
Yeah.
And so this could happen to us, to our family, to our kids. And so just I think what's really exciting right now in the workplace is more people are talking about disabilities than even 15 years ago. And definitely and since the ADA passed a while ago in 1990. So
Yeah.
yeah, so we're on this journey, but I think that there's still a lot of opportunity to make sure disability is included in organizational thoughts of equity.
Yeah, you allude in your in that description of, inclusion, that first step is being seen, right?
Mhm.
And seeing can come in many different forms. Um, Give us an idea of the engagement with counting individuals, census,
Yeah.
and the recognition that there's an entire population here that
Mhm.
often isn't seen.
Yeah. So, well, first, a question for you, since we're just a little quiz, is I always like to ask people, like, how many people with disabilities do you think are in our country? So I'll give you a multiple
Good
choice.
question.
I'll give you
Okay,
multiple
thank you.
choice.
Yeah,
So according to the last US Census, do you think it's 10% of people reported having disabilities, 25% or 50%? Do you have a guess there?
I do have a guess. I'm going to ask a clarifying question.
Okay.
When we're talking about disabilities, we're not just talking about physical disabilities, are we?
No, very broad. So it could be mental health, learning, health, temporary disabilities that maybe folks are navigating. Yeah, attention disabilities, so many things. This kind of
Yeah.
concept of neurodiversity, and things like that. So yeah, do you have a guess?
I do. I'm going to guess 50% because that's a broad category, and I would imagine that number probably fluctuates with folks that are moving through healing processes, of injuries and whatnot. But I would guess 50%.
Yeah, good guess. So it's actually lower than that as far as who
Is it really?
reported. I
Okay.
think you're probably close to right on that, who actually has a disability. But yeah, who reported in the US Census, right? And that's not everyone in our country, but those are who privileged to report in
Yeah.
that census. It was 26%. Um,
26%.
26%. So
Wow.
that's 61 million
That's
people.
that's a lot of people.
Yeah, it's a lot of people. And those are adults, right? So those
Yeah.
aren't even thinking about our children, our little humans, as I call mine, with disabilities, or people, younger people, or people who didn't fill out the census, or people who didn't have that privilege to fill out the census. So yeah, so it's a lot.
It's a lot.
Yeah. And then if you take that to the realm of higher education where I work, the National Center for Education Statistics, which is NCES, in 2020, they showed that 21% of undergraduate students, so at 2 years and 4 years, reported disability
Mm,
identified. So not quite 26, but close, 21%. And you can even look up the stats and see what intersectional identities, like what students with different racial identities report and which ones might report a little lower. And that
interesting.
there's a lot of reasons for that. Could be cultural, could be they don't want some additional stigma that they might already be experiencing. So, anyways, but yeah, so really around a quarter percent of adults with disabilities are identifying.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
So,
many are just living with it,
yeah.
and maybe not even aware of some of the things that they're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, learning disabilities,
Mm-hmm.
cognitive disabilities,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And many don't feel safe to disclose to a new employer or a new school or new place for a while. So they try to pass or hide their disability. And you know, there's there's a lot of there's a lot of challenge with that sometimes. And that's where I think kind of going back to the equity of why this matters is that we want people to we want our workplaces to be diverse and rich and supportive, and we want to treat all people with care and have their basic human rights valued. And so if we can start to create mechanisms where people feel safe to acknowledge they have a disability, request accommodations if needed, or just feel okay to be in the workplace and in the classroom and all the spaces as a person with disability, I think that goes a long way. Um,
Certainly.
yeah.
Yeah. Give me an idea of the history of the ADA Act, and how did we arrive here? I know
Yeah.
you and I have talked a little bit about historical context,
Mhm.
um, but give me an idea.
Yeah. Well, I'm always a student of the history of the ADA. I was born in the early 80s, so I, was pretty young when some of this monumental stuff happened. So there are a lot of other smarter people out there, but I love talking about this. So there's a movement that most folks refer to as the disability rights movement.
Hmm.
Um, and we don't talk about it a lot today, but it was happening simultaneously to some of the civil rights movement. And people and groups with disabilities started to look at these civil rights leaders and say, we want to model that. We can align with this concept of basic human rights. Um, and so what you really saw happening, especially in the 70s, um, and early 80s, is really the four groups that stand out to me when I go back and review the history um, are veterans,
Hmm.
those who served our country in military experience, who came back from that service with some new acquired health or disability experiences, and society wasn't ready for them.
Yeah, that's huge.
Maybe they had a physical disability, or maybe they had a cane, or they were using a wheelchair device and they couldn't get the same access to transportation or housing or employment because there wasn't an elevator to go to where they needed to go. And so we saw a lot of veterans starting to advocate, to demonstrate, and also parents of kids with disabilities were starting to come together
Yeah,
and want to kind of follow the civil rights movement of like, hey, we also think that our students have a equal right to education. And there should be supports in our K through 12 system.
which there were not in the
Right.
1950s, 60s, 40s, 30s.
Yeah.
So many people were institutionalized during those
Yes.
times. That was kind of your option was you can keep your child at home, and you can take care of them, or you can institutionalize them. But they weren't
Yeah.
they weren't welcome into the education system or into jobs outside of that.
Yeah, it was very much harmful, a lot of harmful practices, but also a medical model of disability. Um, and really, yeah, there's a lot of sad history there that I won't go into. But even as these children who didn't have supports, some who were institutionalized or just kind of hidden away, not known what to do with, there was also a lot of like forced sterilization of
Yes.
young adults with disabilities, or perceived disability. We have some pretty disturbing history around people with disabilities, um, way prior to where we are at today. But it's important to talk about.
Yeah.
I will say I'm kind of jumping back to how did the ADA come to be in 1990? Another group that was advocating, I talked about parents and veterans, but it was also those with mental health disabilities. A lot of what they were calling it back then was psychiatric disabilities.
Hmm.
Really not that kind of that fear, and that's trying to standing up against being institutionalized as the only treatment. Um, and then another group was the Deaf President Now. So definitely Google that if you haven't heard of it. There's some cool clips out there, videos. But Gallaudet University, which is our country's um, first deaf college, the students started protesting when there was a presidential search, and they wanted their leader of their college president to be like them, to be a deaf
Wow.
leader. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did it work out?
Well, it did in the long run.
Yeah.
A president who was hearing, who didn't identify as disability, was hired, and that led to, more protests. But then that president resigned, and they revamped the search in a more inclusive way involving students. And then they did get their first deaf president. So, but it got a lot of media attention. It got a lot of, yeah, it got a lot of awareness.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, folks like Judy Heumann, the late Judy Heumann, who passed away a couple years ago, um, and others started connecting with this phrase, nothing about us without us.
Wow.
So those words became banners in some of the marches, the protests in Denver, the sit-in in Berkeley, California, of a government building that Judy Heumann led, and Earl Roberts and a couple others. But yeah, nothing about us without us.
That's a powerful phrase,
Yeah, yeah,
you
and
know.
that slogan was really key in trying to get legislators and senators' attention between the late 70s and into the 1990 passing of the ADA. Like there were so many drafts of the ADA for years before it was passed. Um, and these drafts really weren't involving people with disabilities. So um, people with disabilities kept having to advocate, like, you got to have rules for architecture, you have to have rules for transportation, you have to have regulations for housing, for regulations for education. Like, we need access to all these places that that people in our country access.
Yeah.
So yeah, anyway, so the various groups kind of started advocating and joining together. I guess the last thing I'll say on this, so we can get to other topics, is in March of 1990, a few months before the ADA was signed in July, there's something called the Capitol Crawl. And so if you like imagery, go Google the Capitol Crawl.
I
And
think I've seen images of
yeah.
this.
And I love saying image descriptions, because for my friends out there who have vision disabilities, I will describe the image for you. But one of my favorite images is two young adults with mobility differences and mobility disabilities, ditching their walker and their canes and crawling up the Capitol steps,
Yeah.
um, and demonstrating that this wasn't built for me. This government building, our spaces, they don't work for me. Right. And so they crawled up the steps, reporters took pictures, and that was kind of the first time that the disability rights movement was like on national TV
They
on
actually
like a
got,
6 p.m.
yeah,
prime.
they actually
Yeah,
got attention. Yeah.
it got attention. And then, you know, the legislators couldn't just sit on these draft ADA. They really needed to take some action and sign some federal legislation that would have some protections. So yeah,
Yeah.
anyways, that's the Megan just sort of summary, but
Well,
there's so much there.
I think another interesting story that's worth going and finding images for is World War I veterans
Yeah.
after they were returning were advocating and in fact did a very large march in Washington
Mhm.
and were demanding that veterans' rights, veterans' pay, but they were also asking for services
Yeah.
for their injuries, for for their emerging disabilities. And the answer that the federal government gave was to bring in troops and to gas and fight those veterans out of the Capitol Mall. And I think one of the things that's very important here to kind of connect some of this historical reference is it is important to understand how we put systems together as a collective human being, as a collective human entity, and we do it through our individual choices, but we construct it through our paradigms and our perspectives. And
Mhm.
at the founding of this nation, the paradigm and the perspective that was constructed and created was one that represented an individual such as myself, white and male,
Mhm.
and those individuals could own land, they could participate in government, they could participate in society. Anybody that was outside of that couldn't.
Mhm.
So that included individuals of Native American status, as time went on, formerly enslaved individuals, and people of Hispanic or Mexican status, Asian status. They couldn't own
Mhm.
land. They couldn't participate. And so the 1964 Civil Rights Act is a delineation, and leading up to it, the movements that lead up to it, is a delineation in American legal history in
Yeah.
which the legal recognition of the other begins.
Mhm.
And that's where that begins legally, but it took all the way to 1990. Is that correct?
Mhm. Yep.
And so how does that happen? I mean, why does it take so long?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really good question. Yeah. Yeah, I think I have to sit on that question. I think the second question I think about why does that happen? Why does that take so long? Is why is it still happening today? Like
Good,
we
well said.
have we have the ADA that passed in 1990, and um and Judy Human has a book out about she has a book you should your listener should read her story because she was a great pioneer in this work. But
What's the name of the book?
um I will look it up. It's on here. It has her title in it. I have to
Does it?
remember. It'll come to me. But I think what I'm thinking about is there was a lot of hope with the 1990 ADA being passed, and a lot of the reason and the idea behind it was for equality in employment, right?
Hmm.
It was a huge driving factor. We need equality to housing and transportation and education so we can have equality of employment and have the same experiences as others. But then statistically, if you look at the unemployment data for people with disabilities since the 1990 ADA, it hasn't gotten that much better.
Yeah.
we haven't fully included, welcomed, accepted people with disabilities in our workplaces so that they can be successful overall. Like we haven't made these huge, you know, improvements. And so I think that's a concern for people with disabilities and for people working with people with disabilities is a federal law is great and there's some protection there, but it's not enough.
Right.
You know, we are the people of this country who can help shift the attitude and the culture and the hearts. And we need to be doing that work and we need to be teaching kids to do that work. And so I think that's where I get stuck. I'm like, oh, I so many ways to go about your question of why did it take so long, but why are we still struggling with, oh, I mean, that's a question for all social justice topics, but
Yeah.
you know, basic civil rights law, basic, you know, ADA protections, it's not enough.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, we talk about in our consulting practice when we're working with folks, we talk a lot about systems. I've got a master's degree in systems design, and so does my wife and partner Jerry,
yeah.
and so we come from that perspective, and I think that what we're talking about in this moment exemplifies how systems change has to happen, and how we so often think that it does happen. So the ADA law is passed in 1990,
Mhm.
and immediately the width of doors, ramps,
Mhm.
the ADA specific door handles, toilets, sinks, all of these things are begin to filter out into construction projects
Mhm.
and trying to make the world more accessible.
Mhm.
That's a technical fix, right?
Mhm.
So we passed the ADA and that law, policy, procedure, who we vote for, whatever. Those are technical fixes to an existing system.
Yeah.
Systemic change, right? So if we built a system from the very foundations that is predicated on oppression because it requires it in order to function, then we built a system of oppression, and we built a system of success dependent on who you are, where you fall, where's your ability, where's your
Mhm.
caste, where's your class. And in
Mhm.
those cases, in order to change those systems, it's exactly as you say. You have to change the hearts and the minds of the people within the system. And in this particular case, what we're talking about business owners, employers, to actually make the change to bring an individual who fits within this group onto a board or into an executive C-suite,
Mhm.
or just hiring them into the organization and making appropriate accommodations in order to
Mhm.
do so. What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think um that's why I'm in the role that I'm in is to be doing this work. And um I think that positive change is coming. Like I think that we are on a slow track to be more inclusive in this country for people with disabilities. Um, but in my opinion, we need to think about the interconnection of all of these marginalized groups,
Mm,
and not that all of them have intersection or multiple identities. Some of them do. It's really important to know that, to remember that. But also that we need to think about not leaving people with disabilities out of the consideration for the equity justice work that folks are doing.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to jump back on Judy Human's
Please.
book, it's Becoming Human, her last
Awesome.
name. Yeah. So HEUMANN, or sorry, Being Human.
Being
I
human.
was, yeah, not Michelle Obama's book.
Cool. I'll put a link in the description for the podcast so people can find it. So, So one of the ways that we can do this within the workplace is organizations can hire an accessibility expert within their organizations, and a separate accommodations expert. Explain a little bit about how that works. Where does the equity expert that we've been hiring, for the past few years fit into that role?
So yeah, just kind of thinking about accessibility leadership at an institution or a business and accommodation leadership. They're really two different focuses. So this idea of IT accessibility or digital accessibility is really, really important. And it's kind of a new wave of thinking about including people with disabilities. But really, it's accessible accessibility work has been around for a long time, but I think it has new attention since the pandemic,
Mm,
when like Jeremy and I are meeting on Zoom right now to do a podcast, right?
yeah.
Where before, like maybe we were driving across the state to do a podcast, right? To meet up in person. And in our workplaces and in our education, there's so much online or hybrid interaction going on that it's really rare that things aren't web-based and and all the things. So people with disabilities who use assistive technologies or technologies to help them access our web world
Hmm.
have really been not thought about by big businesses and apps and in institutions. And we are discriminating against these people all the time. And people with disabilities who use assistive technologies, they could be people who are blind or low vision, who are using a screen reader. They could be people with reading disabilities who can visually see what's on a screen, but they can't read it in the same way that maybe a other person can.
Sure.
Could be people without use of a hand and is using, other assistive technologies to navigate. Anyway, so many people with disabilities um, haven't been thought of when we design web pages and apps or educational online spaces or business spaces. So that's really the world of accessibility. I think it should be an IT position. I think it should be someone unlike me who knows like how to code and how to fix the HTML on a web page and is way more focused and faster and at it and studied at it than I am. But there's this whole world of information technology in digital accessibility that is vastly growing. It's a
Hmm.
pretty competitive pay if IT people want to go into that. But I would say most institutions who are really tracking some of the new ADA regulations that were signed, about a week or two ago,
Yeah.
in Title II, at least for Title II of the ADA, it's very much clarifying kind of this world standard, which is called WCAG 2.0 AA. I know he's laughing.
What does
Um,
that stand for?
so WCAG is I have to spell it. WG AG, but it's the Web Content Accessibility
Web content.
guidelines. Sorry, it's WC. See, I can't say web content, that's a C. WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines.
Guidelines.
So those have been around for a long time. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. But the bar has slowly raised to different levels. And so most of us are at a 2.0 level at
Hmm.
least. And so there's different standards. But anyway, so
And
the
we're at a 2.0 level in the way that we're interacting with this content,
mhm,
both in location, my laptop, my mobile phone, my television, my
mhm,
iPad, but also in my ability to navigate the content and the pages within those.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, I there's a lot of experts on accessibility testing, and guidelines and things like that. But if you are working at an institution or starting a company or are a professional, it's important that we think about having a person, an IT person that starts to lead efforts to make sure that, the web pages and the interfaces for your customers are meeting, starting with basic accessibility and then good accessibility so that everyone can feel welcome to engage in your product and in your spaces. So it's different than accommodating individual employees or customers.
Mhm.
It's really making sure that your web presence is inclusive and works for everyone. And when it doesn't, there's a form on your website of who they can contact as this IT person that can take accessibility feedback. So, um, yeah, so I think there's going to continue to be a lot of case law about people with disabilities when they interact with apps or um, businesses or colleges or spaces where things aren't accessible to them, and then they can't
Yeah.
apply or they can't learn, they can't get in to find out information about something or they, right. And so it's an area that we need to really be talking about.
Yeah.
And so I think they're kind of like two separate experts in an organization, as accommodation leader and accessibility leader. And I think what you asked about is then who's the equity leader, right?
Yeah. Well, before we dive into that, so if the accessibility expert is within the IT realm, is the accommodations expert within the human resource realm? Is that where that?
Yeah, yeah, I would say that would be the case
Yeah.
for places that for businesses. And then, in education, you also need a accommodation expert for the students in the classroom, right?
Mhm. Yep.
But yeah, I think typically for most businesses, it's having a point person or expert, in HR and an accessibility expert in IT. And then depending on the size of the organization, maybe also a specialized person within the equity professional development team who is leading the awareness of people with disabilities, the inclusion, consulting and supporting those accessibility IT person and the accommodation person in HR to make sure our practices aren't burdensome and
Yes.
aren't creating like, okay, we'll think about your accessibility feedback, but it's going to take us 3 weeks to acknowledge. And the employee is just trying to do their job, or the person is just trying to access your, product. So also like making sure that they are reasonable and responsive and just being another person. Or your equity person, if it's a smaller organization, could get trainings and could just start to infuse some disability leadership practices and ideas or events, or trainings, those kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then when we're talking about those two, um, how does equity fit into that? How does the equity position fit into that?
Yeah, um I think it can be different for different organizations, but I think an equity leader needs to um be aware of, the disability stigmas that a lot of new employees and and staff bring, um, and ensuring that they're talking with middle level managers, about how do we support people with disabilities, or how do we and probably sometimes, I've heard people say, well, there aren't any people with disabilities that I know of. Like, I know of these two, and they think about the people with obvious physical disabilities that they've
Yeah.
noticed, right?
Right.
When more disabilities are invisible,
Yes.
more people pass or hide or can. And so just making sure that equity person is educating really ideally everyone, but at least supervisors, that like, what is disability? It's so broad.
It is.
It's so
Yes.
broad. And so it's actually a lot of us. and while not everyone might need accommodations, they should all feel welcomed and okay to talk about these things. Um, and I think the other thing too is, disability, of what is disability, that definition will continue to grow.
Mm,
Long COVID is starting to be considered by most as a disability.
yeah,
That isn't a like 2 week thing that's going away. It's coming with its own symptomology, and it's taking many folks a long time to get diagnosed or get support around it or believed around it. Um and we're still we still don't know all the repercussions of the patterns with long haul or long COVID. And so in at least in the disability community that I work in Washington, as practitioners for students in higher education, we're thinking about it like a health disability.
sure.
And I don't know that, big businesses are thinking about it that way. Or
Yeah, I
yeah.
don't know that they are either.
Mhm.
I think one of the things there's things are shifting in many respects regarding perspective and paradigm in this. Earlier, when we were talking about how in the past individuals with physical disabilities or even mental disabilities were cognitive disabilities were they were institutionalized. And
Mhm.
you had referred to that as a medical model. And what we see is we see an evolution away from a medical model. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think for the most part, right? I think there are still spaces and businesses and areas operating under a medical model, but I think overall we've shifted to more of a social model of disability, um, where there was a big movement that people still talk about using like person first language, and saying, you know, people with disabilities or students with disabilities first, and kind of getting away from this word disabled, like you are disabled, instead of saying like, oh, you are a person with a disability, or if they name their disability, you are a person with autism, right? So
Yes.
there was
Yeah.
this kind of this movement, um and I think more recently, I've seen it a lot in the last, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years. There are some people there's different camps, right? There's different ideas of this, but there are some people who are trying to own back some of those words that we were talking about as harmful 7 or 8 years ago. I was saying that using the word disabled is harmful. But
Yeah.
there are other people who are owning back that word. Like, I want to be identified as disabled. I'm proud, right? So there's also
Yeah.
this whole movement of disability pride.
Yeah.
There's a disability pride parade every year in New York City, right? And so like the spectrum of people with disabilities, we identify differently, and that is okay. But I would say overall, the movement in our country has been more toward a social model, and thinking about society, workspaces, websites, buildings, classrooms, lobbies, front counters, those spaces, those societal spaces may have barriers.
Sure.
And so our responsibility, not necessarily the person, right? That would have been medical model. Our responsibility as business owners, as people serving people in the community, is to modify those barriers so that they're designed universally to try to support, the variety of people that could come in. And so I think, kind of putting the onus on society, what can we do to welcome people with disabilities, instead of the medical model. So like, something's wrong with you, you got to fix it, you got to fit into our box, um, because we're only going to do this one little thing, and if that doesn't work for you, sorry, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we are shifting, or we have shifted to more of a social model. Is Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And
which is a shift
Yeah.
in responsibility, right?
Yeah.
If I'm hearing you correctly, right? It's a
Yeah.
shift from the responsibility rests on the individual, and
Hmm.
if you can't fit into the model that we've got, then you're institutionalized or you stay home.
Yeah.
To a social model where there's social responsibility, and it's up to the society in order to shift the
Mhm.
model so that it's accommodating.
Yeah. And I think even though I don't work in the K through 12 system, as a observer of that system, I think that there's been some really good attempts in the K through 12 special education to become more of a social model and to infuse kids with disabilities in like the general classroom as much as possible, right? Um, I think that there's been, you know, a lot of initiatives around that. And I think that's
Yeah.
just an example of trying to get, you know, toward that social model of like these students belong in our classrooms. We want to include them in our classrooms. So,
Yeah, I think the one of the areas of the social model um, that is getting some scrutiny is the social model from neurodivergence, or the idea that because what we end up with is we end up with individuals who, rather than being medically diagnosed with neurodivergent conditions, they're self-diagnosed with neurodivergent conditions, and so now we've moved into experience, right? We've moved into an individual's personal experience.
mhm.
And so where's the boundary? How far do we go with accommodation?
Yeah. So I will answer this question so much differently today than honestly I would have a few years ago.
Good.
I think I was still stuck in the medical model of disability. Um, and I think, uh, you know, I think when we're serving marginalized communities, we always need to grow and get better and listen to those we're serving.
Yeah.
And for me personally, on different groups I was connected to across Washington, we there was a lot of good movement happening a couple years before COVID, uh, around why are educational spaces and businesses requiring so much documentation
Mm,
from people with disabilities to get basic accommodations. Why? The
yeah.
ADA doesn't say that we have to. The ADA doesn't say that you have to have XYZ, paperwork proving your diagnosis. But that's what we all went to when the ADA passed, right? Like, let's prove your disability before you're
Yeah.
welcomed in the door. We're not opening the door for you unless you prove your disability, And then who were we leaving out? Who had access to medical care? Who did
Right.
not?
Yes.
Whose cultures supported that? Whose did not? You know, BIPOC students have not gotten evaluated, in our K through 12 for disability, at least in Washington State, in the same way that all students are getting evaluated for disability. And so I think we in the disability, support community started talking, at least I in 2018, about we really got to start becoming more flexible
Mm,
on what kind of documentation practices we're asking of people with disabilities, in accommodation processes. And so we started becoming more flexible, and trying to be more open. Just turn in what you have, come meet with us. Let's try to help you get what you have. But then in COVID 2020, unfortunately, it took COVID for organizations to finally feel like they had the freedom to not have any documentation at all.
yeah.
And so what I saw
Yeah, that makes
is that,
sense.
yeah, is that some colleges and some businesses were welcoming employee accommodations and believing someone's story.
Yes.
I'm
Yeah,
going to
so now
believe your
we've
story.
shifted to this
Yeah.
human reaction, right?
Yep.
Like, I'm going to see you as a human
Mhm.
being.
Mhm.
I think that
Yeah.
that is that's where we need to go, right?
Mhm.
Because seeing individuals as human beings, this idea that your problems stop at the door,
Mhm.
don't bring your problems into work. And this idea, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Human beings are human beings, and they're bringing all kinds of things with them. Um, what I think again, as I kind of work through this and listen to folks, is again we're faced we're still faced with a crisis of how we construct the world in our collective minds,
Mhm.
because we're taught if either linear or con, critical thinking, right? These are the two
Mhm.
methodologies. And so critical thinking is what we're using here, right? We're using this. Look, there's all these people that are having these experiences, and it's limiting their ability and their access. And all we have to do is believe them. That's all we have to do.
Mhm.
And that's where we need to go.
Right.
We also are going to have to cultivate an ability to be systemic thinkers, because there's an element here that we've got to keep our eyes open for, and there's an element that we have to keep our eyes open for all the time, except we're not trained to be systemic thinkers, and so we miss
Mhm.
it. We just linearly move down the road. And what that is if a whole group of people are saying, and I'm going to use the neurodivergent, I'm neurodivergent and I'm self-diagnosed. And okay, come on, let's move through the accommodation. It's not
Right.
about we got to flip we've now we've now are dealing and working with the individual, but we've got to think of the system as well. Okay,
Yeah.
what is happening in which the age group of between 6 and 22 are in mass self-diagnosing as neurodivergent? What's
Mhm.
going on here? We need to ask some questions. What are we engaging with in our society that is causing our children in order to be higher in anxiety, lower in attention span, higher in depression rates, higher in suicide
Mhm.
rates?
Mhm.
And we're not asking those questions. And that's an important question, because the thing that we're engaging with is just going to become more and more dominant in our life.
Those mobile phones, the
It's,
technology.
it's the technology. It's the algorithm. It's not the screen. It's not the
Mhm.
Facebook. Well, it is that because it's privately owned, right? It's for
Mhm.
profit. So there's no motivation to change. But the algorithm just keeps feeding us and feeding
Mhm.
us and feeding us. What's that doing to self-esteem? What's that doing to identity? What's that doing
Mhm.
to, and so that's why we also need to be thinking systemically. We need to care for individuals humanly, and we need
Mhm.
to think about where's this rise coming from? What
Yeah.
are your thoughts?
Oh, wow. I mean, like how much how much time do we have? I think for me it keeps coming back to this is probably a more simpler answer, but it's the heart of it.
Mm,
It's kind of that well-being and spiritual health is my opinion. Is like does that person feel valued? Does that person feel loved? Does that person feel cared for? Do they have people who truly value like who they are and disabilities or without disabilities? And if they don't and they feel lost, right? I think um their experiences in our world are going to be a lot more difficult. And how can we just be accepting of the various nature of all of us, right? It's like in some communities, um you know ADHD may be viewed as a strength,
certainly.
um and and a beautiful thing. But in another space, that person with ADHD may feel othered, belittled, not safe to fully be them, depressed. And you know what I mean? And so
Yep.
these young children, thinking of the children growing up, I think they need to feel valued and loved on that basic human right. Whether they experience disabilities, whether they're starting to acquire disabilities or not, like just having that inclusive environment where we talk about disability in school, we talk
Yep.
about differences. Disability is really differences.
Yes,
This idea of neurodiversity, in my opinion, is that we all think, move, breathe, eat, learn, concentrate, articulate, process in unique and varied ways.
we do indeed.
Yeah. And not one way is the right and only way. Um, and so I think normalizing disability, even though there is no such thing as normal, but making it acceptable that we are a neurodiverse, people, um, and just trying to help, kind of help emotional well-being with these young kids is that's just my opinion. I'm not a licensed counselor, and I think that um, having supervised counseling centers before, I think that mental health counseling is an amazing field
It's
and that we
vital.
all need counselors at different points in our lives. And I think that K
Indeed.
through 12 kiddos need, counselors in our schools. We need to have licensed counselors. I kind of assumed that, okay, it's 2024. All the schools that my kids are in, they all have licensed counselors, right?
Yep.
And come to find out, they don't all have licensed
Lots
counselors,
of them
right?
don't. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so, anyways, that's another tangent. But I think, that field and that practice of mental health counseling and those clinicians are really trying to, in my opinion, they're trying to support emotional well-being and and um and kind of that, you know, good health, holistic health.
Yes.
But I think a lot of it, unfortunately, is teaching people how to create that for themselves, teaching them how to cope, teaching them how to maneuver
Well,
because they're
yeah.
connecting with these societal barriers
Right. Yeah.
that may not be welcoming to them or be putting up roadblocks for them, right? And so I think it's both, like we need society to continue to talk about this concept of ableism, which is this idea that we're leaving out and discriminating against people with disabilities, and often we don't even know about it. And so,
Yeah.
like, how are we, making sure practices welcome people with disabilities in every aspect of our society, and also provide, those individual professional supports for the growing generation. I don't know.
No,
Anyways, that's my tangent with kids, but
I think you're totally right on. I think the one point, linear thinking puts us into binaries, right? Like, it's got
Mm,
to be this and not this, or it's got to be this but not
yeah,
this. But it can also be both, and
totally. It has to be both.
right, that's polarity, right? And
Mhm.
so I think that when we're talking about kids and that idea of mental health, helping them navigate around these barriers, I think that's so
Mhm.
true.
Mhm.
We as a society have a responsibility in order to remove the barriers that limit um, equitable opportunity.
Mhm.
And one of the ways that we do that is we equip a society of individuals who are able to see them and remove them. And that's where the mental health piece comes in that it's not just about helping them navigate these things. It's also about equipping them to become more resilient, equipping
Mhm.
them to become more coherent. Life's hard.
Yeah.
Life is hard, um, and um, and uh, and it's hard whether you have um, born into a world where you have full working ability of your body and your mind, and or you don't,
Mhm.
And we are all different. We all do see the world through these eyes
Mhm.
differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think, yeah, that was a good question. And
What does it look like
yeah.
when an individual is passing in this society and they can hide in that passing? They choose to hide in that passing.
Yeah, I think we've touched on that a little bit. I think I think most of the time when people with disabilities, you can folks can go research it, but when I look at the research, most of the time people with disabilities still pass at first when they're starting a new employment opportunity, and they don't disclose disability. They
Mhm.
might try to cope or mask disability to kind of fit into a pattern and spend a lot of energy and time uh, trying to fit into whatever the standard or normal environment is of that workplace. But I think the bigger question is why?
Good question.
Why do people with disabilities feel like they have to do that in
Why
one
should they even have
space?
to? Mhm.
Yeah, but in another space, they don't have to.
Yeah.
And I think that's really an important question to ask people with disabilities when you find them and have them one to one of like, thank you so much for sharing with me that you have this learning disability and this health condition. And,
Yeah.
as your coworker, as your friend, sorry it took you this long to be comfortable sharing that, right? And
Yes.
then starting to think about what can I do as a professional to make it where they could share that up front if they wanted to and ask for, accommodation is usually like a tiny little adjustment.
It's probably not a big deal most of the time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I go to these medical treatments and I need to adjust my work schedule,
Right.
2 days a month. Or, what really helps me is if I can record this session so that I can go back and process and note take and all the things, right? Or
Yes.
so yeah. So I think I don't know. I think I'm more interested in and I don't know all the answers. I think everyone is an individual, but I think there's so many different reasons on why people pass.
Mm.
But whenever I've asked students I serve or people I know on why, it really comes to because they didn't feel safe. They didn't feel
Yeah.
safe often to share their disability or share a little bit of an adjustment or need that would have made it equitable for them. They don't feel safe,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Tough to feel
Mm-hmm.
safe when you're not treated
Mm-hmm.
like a human being,
Mm-hmm.
Leave your problems at home. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's just not very human.
Yeah.
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, Megan.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate your insight and your expertise on this particular subject. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
I think just I guess start to research and read or whatever your learning modality is, podcasts or books or articles. My brother always teases me that I never read books because he's a brother and he can be real with me in that way. But I listen to books, right? And so I
It's
think
an effective way to do it.
it's totally, yes. So I do read books through listening and I think research some of the topics around disability if it's new to you. Whether it's disability history, disability identity is another topic. If you're thinking about, oh, passing because I have a disability or my friend or my family, my partner will want to know more about that, look up topics on disability identity and disability stigma. Um, and and there's this whole concept of disability justice, which is really kind of the newest social justice movement of the disability rights movement. So there's so much out there. So read, learn, get involved, think about it when you're voting would be my thing too. Not too long ago, there was a movement to try to repeal the
Yeah.
ADA
Yes.
and it was getting some teeth
Yep.
and people who experience disability and rely on at least the basic protections of the ADA were really scared. And so think about that. um, and think about those with disabilities and how you're including them and being equitable in your treatment of them. And I get those are just things to leave you with, but I don't know.
That's
And
great.
also like we're all learning, right? And so continue to learn and grow. And yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you again. I sincerely appreciate your
Mhm.
time, Megan.
Yeah. Thank you.
Uh, well, everyone, thank you for joining us for another Plowline podcast. And if you are interested in the work that Jerry and I do, you can check us out at co3consulting.net. That is CO, the number three consulting.net. And as you may have heard, Jerry has just finished a children's book called Let's Live Aloha. And as we were editing her memoir that we're working on, she doesn't like the idle hands, so she started a children's book, and I handed the edits back to her and began editing that, and it's fantastic. It's already won one award, and we've submitted for several others, so you can check that out at evolutionofaloha.com. And if you're interested in contributing and being a member of what we're doing here at the Plowline Podcast and the Evolution of Aloha podcast, then you can become a contributor by going to patreon.com/Plowline Productions. Thanks everyone for joining today, and thank you, Megan. We'll chat soon.